Check this out. These are all the major Microsoft Windows versions released in the last 30 years. If we assign each version a rating based on general user feedback and critical reception, a strange pattern starts to emerge. For almost 3 decades, Windows versions have followed an alternating quality pattern where every second release is well received, while the ones in between are widely considered disappointing. Even the latest addition to the Microsoft family, Windows 11, seems to continue this trend. 3 years after its release, it is still widely regarded as underwhelming and has yet to surpass its predecessor, Windows 10, in market share. I'm not the first person to notice this strange phenomenon. In fact, forum posts discussing this pattern date back 10 years, showing that users have been aware of it for quite some time now. This got me really curious and raised a few important questions. First, what does a good or bad Windows release even mean, and how do we determine this classification? Is this just a case of cherry-picking certain Windows versions to fit the pattern, or is there actual data backing this claim? To find out, I've been digging through forums, gathering user opinions and analyzing sales data to investigate this strange pattern of alternating quality. And ultimately to answer the big question: why does every other Windows version suck? To do that, we first have to address a big issue. What even counts as a Windows release? You see, this isn't as obvious as you might think. If you check the Wikipedia page for Windows version history, you will see a graph that might look confusing at first. Let me break it down for you. The first 5 versions of Windows were all based on MS-DOS, which was a text-based operating system that managed files, ran programs, and handled basic hardware interactions before graphical interfaces became common. These early Windows versions weren't standalone operating systems, but rather graphical user interfaces running on top of DOS. Then, in the early 90s, Microsoft released Windows 3.1 for home users, which was still DOS-based. However, they also introduced Windows NT 3.1 designed for business use. The NT version, which stands for New Technology, was the first standalone Windows operating system that didn't rely on MS-DOS at all. This split Windows into 2 separate lines: the consumer-focused DOS-based Windows 9X series, which included Windows 95, Windows 98 and Windows ME, and the professional-focused NT series, consisting of Windows NT 3.1, NT 3.5, NT 4.0 and Windows 2000. After the disastrous launch of Windows ME, which we'll cover very soon, Microsoft abandoned the DOS-based line entirely and unified both branches with the release of Windows XP, bringing the stability of the NT platform to the consumer market for the first time. But even after the unification, not every Windows version is considered a major release. For example, after Windows 8 was heavily criticized for its poor design choices, Microsoft released Windows 8.1, which introduced much needed improvements. However, many still see it as more of a refinement than a brand new Windows version. For this video, we'll focus on major Windows releases, those that brought significant changes and were intended as the primary OS. So, let's take a closer look at the pattern that makes every other Windows, well, not so great. We start with Windows 95, a release that introduced many features still present in Windows today, such as the taskbar and the start menu. Microsoft went all in on marketing, spending over $1 billion to promote Windows 95. They even paid the Rolling Stones to use their single "Start Me Up" in a commercial as a nod to the start menu. On top of that, they released a 30-minute promotional video starring Friends actors Jennifer Aniston and Matthew Perry showcasing the new features. All that marketing money wasn't wasted. Windows 95 was a massive commercial success, selling over 1 million copies in just 4 days after release. But as the pattern suggests, a good release is always followed by a disappointing one. And that is exactly the case with Windows 98. It featured a similar UI to its predecessor with small adjustments to improve the user experience and added more internet integration features. While Windows 98 commercial performance was decent, it was plagued with bugs and stability issues, which ultimately makes it a flawed release. In fact, its instability was famously demonstrated when Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, encountered the blue screen of death during a live presentation of Windows 98. In the year 2000, Microsoft decided to release 2 separate Windows editions: Windows 2000 for the NT platform and Windows ME as the next entry to the Windows 9X branch. Windows 2000 was much more stable than Windows 98 and was marketed as the most secure Windows ever released. Although that definitely wasn't the case due to several vulnerabilities, it is regarded as a generally good release. The same cannot be said for Windows Millennium Edition. Windows ME, sometimes mockingly called Mistake Edition, was extremely unstable and is considered one of the worst Windows releases of all time. It shares this infamous honor with 2 other releases, which we are going to cover very soon. After the disaster that was Windows ME, the DOS-based lineage was completely discontinued, and Microsoft decided to shift its entire customer base to the much more stable NT platform with the release of Windows XP in 2001. This change lasts to this day, as all modern releases are still based on the NT kernel. XP was completely the opposite of its predecessor, and it is widely recognized as one of the best Windows versions. It received critical acclaim for its increased performance, stability, more intuitive user interface, improved hardware support, and expanded multimedia capabilities. This legendary OS was followed by the release of Windows Vista in 2007. Users complained about the issues with security features, performance, driver support, and product activation. This granted Windows Vista a spot among the worst Windows versions of all time. Following the pattern, in 2009 Microsoft released Windows 7, which was very well received. It was an incremental upgrade to Vista and addressed many of the issues with the previous OS, such as the overly aggressive user account control pop-ups. In just 6 months after release, over 100 million copies of Windows 7 had been sold worldwide. That number grew to 630 million licenses by July 2012. As you all know by now, after Windows 7 we got Windows 8, the final contender for the title of the worst Windows release ever. Windows 8 was universally hated for its user interface, which removed the start menu and replaced it with a start screen that was awkward to navigate with a mouse and keyboard. The entire design felt like it was meant for mobile devices and tablets rather than traditional desktops. As previously mentioned, in an attempt to address the backlash, Microsoft released Windows 8.1 with some improvements. However, even after the update, the OS was still poorly received, and some users simply refused to upgrade from Windows 7. In 2015, Microsoft released Windows 10, skipping the number 9. This version received positive reviews with particular praise for bringing back the traditional desktop interface. Over time, Windows 10 became the most popular Windows release ever, reaching over 1 billion active installations worldwide. Then, in 2021, Windows 11 was introduced as the latest addition to the Windows family, and so far it's been a rather disappointing release. Users have criticized it for aggressively pushing Microsoft products like Teams and making it more difficult to switch away from the default Edge browser. Setting up Windows 11 now requires a Microsoft account, and the start menu displays ads, which many find intrusive. Microsoft also removed well-established features such as the ability to move the taskbar to the top or sides of the screen. Overall, it's fair to say that Windows 11 follows the pattern and stands as another disappointing release. Okay, but what about the data? Does this pattern also show up in sales and market share analytics? Well, to a large extent, yes. I found a dataset that tracks the market share of each desktop Windows version since 2009, and it clearly reflects the pattern. Only 3 versions, Windows XP, Windows 7 and Windows 10, have reached the number 1 spot in the market share during this period. In contrast, the intervening releases, Windows Vista, Windows 8 and Windows 11, never claimed the top spot, instead peaking at 2nd place at best. However, this might change for Windows 11, as Windows 10's market share continues to decline, especially with Microsoft ending support for Windows 10 in October 2025. But what about earlier releases? I found data that, again, confirms the pattern. Windows 95 peaked at 57% market share, followed by Windows 98, which underperformed with just a 17% peak. Then came Windows 2000, which reached 41% market share in 2003, the earliest recorded data I could find. Therefore, it is possible that the peak market share was even higher. As for Windows ME, I couldn't find any data about its market share, which leads me to believe that this release was so insignificant that it didn't have any impact on the operating system market. With all that in mind, we can conclude that the alternating quality pattern seems to be a real thing. But are there any explanations for it? I found a few theories online. Some of them are straight up ridiculous, like the one that says that this is all a marketing strategy to lower the expectation for each next release. But a more promising theory has to do with migration cycles. It suggests that most companies don't upgrade their OS quickly enough to hit the 2nd cycle, which happens to land on the intervening releases. Migrating to a different version of Windows is costly, especially when the current version is still working fine and is still supported. I would love to hear your opinion on this. Please let me know what you think down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching.